In this presentation, we will delve into market structures, moving from perfect or pure competition to monopoly. To begin with, let's walk through what makes a perfectly competitive market. First, we have a relatively large number of firms so that no one firm can alter the price in the market by increasing or decreasing the quantity sold in that market. Secondly, the product should be fairly homogeneous so that product differentiation will prove too costly to undertake. When the demand curve facing the firm is horizontal or parallel to the quantity axis, perfect competition is achieved. Next, number three, the firm has no price power. Number four, the firm's demand curve will be perpendicular to the price axis at the equilibrium price in the market. Finally, number five, in the market in which the firm is a supplier, the consumer surplus is maximized at the equilibrium price, and the total revenue going to the firm is just equal to the sum of the firm's productive resources opportunity costs. If all firms are identical, the same condition will exist for all of those firms. To summarize, in long-term equilibrium, both efficiency and equity are achieved, and the biases toward recession and inflation on a macro, as in macroeconomics level, will be eliminated. This is the beauty of competitive free market capitalism. It is a limiting case or the end game of the march toward a perfectly competitive market. Adam Smith's invisible hand of competition is achieved except when competition is found wanting in markets such as is less frequently the case in crude oil markets today. They're much more competitive than they have been in recent years, or in previous years rather. At any rate, profits are maximized, but they will only be normal or at their opportunity cost level. This means that the price AR, or average revenue, will be just equal to the firm's average cost or average total cost. Normal profits are productive resource cost and under the cost curves. Average total cost are at their minimum. Price equals marginal cost, MC, or marginal cost. Since this is a perfectly competitive market in long-term equilibrium, price also equals MR, or marginal revenue, as the demand for average revenue curves are coincident with the marginal revenue curve. Remember that the demand or average revenue is horizontal and parallel to the quantity or x-axis at the vertical height of the equilibrium market price. So again, moving from left to right. This is where the theoretical economic welfare conditions of equity and efficiency come together. The productive resources, or owners of those productive resources, are earning no more than their opportunity cost levels in compensation, and the firm is producing the maximum number of goods and services to the household at the lowest possible price. Again, note that the consumer surplus, as seen in the market graph on the left, is at a maximum, subject to the constraint that the price and hence total revenue of the firm is just sufficient to cover all opportunity costs, no more, no less. Next, we will consider monopolistic competition. To begin with, why does a monopolistically competitive firm have a downward sloping demand curve? In the past, the term monopolistically competitive, coined by Joan Robinson, also the tangency solution, referred to a slight departure from perfect competition. The demand curve sloped downward to the right, but competition forced it to be tangent to the AC, or average cost curve. However, this meant that the average cost, or AC, was not at a minimum. Price was slightly above the marginal cost, MC, but profits were just normal at their opportunity cost level. Likewise, Edward Chamberlain, about the same time, presented a similar model he labeled imperfect competition. As an aside, neither Robinson nor Chamberlain were talking about oligopolies, cartels, or monopolies. Monopolistic competition occurs in markets with slightly differentiated products where average cost, again AC, is tangent to the demand curve, but is not at the bottom. Unlike perfect competition where the products are homogeneous and the average cost curve AC touches the demand curve at the bottom. Efficiency is violated because the price is above the marginal cost. The net result is that quantity is less than otherwise would be the case in perfect competition. In short, efficiency is violated, but not equity. This is the tangency solution that occurs in what is traditionally called monopolistic or imperfect competition by Robinson and Chamberlain. The demand curve slopes downward to the right, but is just tangent to the average total cost curve. This is also where marginal revenue, MR, equals marginal cost, MC. Profits are maximized, but are only normal or at their opportunity cost level, and no economic profit occurs. Again, normal or opportunity cost level profits are not above the cost curves. Moving on to oligopoly. Introducing oligopoly, or the oligopolistic market structure, a market structure which is characterized by a small number of firms whose behavior is interdependent. There are a variety of oligopolies ranging from some industries where the product is homogeneous and others where it is differentiated quite a bit across producers. Economies of scale may be the most important barrier to entry, presenting a high cost of entry equated again with huge startup costs which would deter entry. And think in terms of something like the auto industry. In general, oligopolists are independent, but there is no one general theory of oligopoly explaining their behavior. Just the same, many theories have been developed. Let's start with collusion and cartels. Collusion is an agreement among firms to divide the market or to fix market price. A cartel is a group of firms that agree to coordinate production and pricing decisions, thus behaving as a monopolist. Effective functioning of a cartel is complicated by differences in cost, among the producers, the number of firms in the cartel, production levels, and thus price agreements become more difficult as the number of firms in the cartel increases. A cartel's success depends on blocking entry of new firms into the industry. There's also a continuing temptation to cheat, which can undermine our cartels and typically does. A price leader is a firm whose price is adopted by the rest of the industry. Okay, so now let's focus on a price leader again, or a dominant firm whose price is adopted by the rest of the oligopolistic industry. The oligopolists face a market structure that has a few sellers, one of which is dominant or has the greatest market power. There are plenty of examples of this over the course of American history. Andrew Carnegie, for example, reorganized the steel industry in the U.S. in the early 1900s, and his corporation ended up with close to 80% of the capacity. It was formerly much less concentrated with hundreds of smaller firms. Analysts generally agree that since the reorganization by Carnegie, his firm, the United States Steel Corporation, or USS, dictated prices in the industry until the late 1950s. First in an overt fashion, and later in a covert manner through such techniques as basing point systems, for example, Pittsburgh price plus pricing. General Motors also followed the same pattern a few years later. William Durant, Billy Durant, cobbled together several independent auto firms into GM, and Alfred Sloan brought the financial blessing of the Eastern financial powers, Wall Street, to his aid. As this dominant firm status began to disappear through first imports and later through transplants, the American portion of the auto industry was forced to restructure, and as a cause of its reduced stature, again across the auto industry that we're speaking about, GM here. Note that the birth of competition in the automotive market has many repercussions on labor as well. In such states as Michigan, which have been losing jobs to other areas, not just outside the U.S., but for the most part, actually, to the southeastern portion of the United States, the non-union labor states. Similar to a monopolistically competitive firm, The oligopolist profit maximization occurs where a firm produces at the output level where marginal cost MC and marginal revenue MR intersect. The profit maximization price in this graphic A is on the demand curve. The same quantity B where MC or marginal cost equals MR, same quantity level. So if you drop down from the demand curve to the B, that would show you the quantity. It is important to note that in oligopolistic markets, both equity and efficiency are violated. Again, this is whenever the demand curve is above the average cost curve. So now let's move on to the theory of monopoly. And again, the theory of monopoly is based on the following. It's pretty straightforward. One, there's one seller. Secondly, the single seller sells a product for which there is no close substitute. And finally, three, there are extremely high barriers to entry. Now, the barriers to entry, in terms of the barriers to entry, there might be legal barriers where public franchise is granted to a firm by a government that permits the firm to provide a particular good or service and excludes all others from doing the same. Economies of scale would be the case where in some industries low average total costs are only obtained through large-scale production. If only one firm can survive in that industry, the firm is called a natural monopoly. Another barrier might be the exclusive ownership of a necessary resource. Existing firms may be protected from entry of from new firms rather by the exclusive or near exclusive ownership of a resource needed to enter the industry. Think of diamonds in years gone by. That's changed, of course, of late with the introduction of synthetic diamonds. Excuse me. So now let's move on to monopoly pricing and the output decisions thereof. A monopolist is a price searcher. That is a seller that has the ability to control some degree of the product that it sells. To some degree, the price, rather, of the product that it sells. In the theory of monopoly, the monopoly firm is the industry, and the industry is the monopoly firm. They are one and the same. For the monopolist, note that the price P of the good being sold is greater than the marginal greater than marginal revenue. Again, price is greater than marginal revenue. If a firm maximizes revenue, does it automatically maximize profits as well? Let's see. Well, the monopolist that seeks to maximize profits produces a quantity of output in which MR equals MC. Again, marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and charges the highest price per unit at which this quantity of output can be sold. The monopolist profit maximizing price and quantity of output speaks to the point where the monopolist produces the quantity of output, in this case A1 in this graph, at which marginal revenue again is equal to marginal cost, and charges the highest price per unit at which the quantity of output can be sold, A, dropping down to the going across rather to the y-axis. Notice that the profit maximizing quantity of output price is greater again than the marginal cost. Again, P is greater than MC. Keep in mind that the equitable level for a monopoly is indicated by the price level B and the output level B1. Again, dropping B1 in this case, dropping down to the x-axis or the quantity axis. This is often where pricing decisions are arrived at for natural monopolies like public utilities. Lastly, at price C, where the marginal cost intersects the average revenue cost, where they would meet, the quantity C1 would be the desirable point for society. But since the firm cannot cover its average cost, it could not function there in the long run without significant subsidies. Again, this would be probably along the lines of a public utility, where there would be some sort of arrangement with a state or the state public utilities commission or whatnot. So again, referring back to a few basic ideas on cost curves relating to efficiency and equity. Efficiency is achieved when the per capita standard of living is achieved. This occurs when price equals marginal cost and average costs are at a minimum. The consumer is receiving the most bang for the buck. Equity is achieved when the productive resource employed receives no more than their opportunity cost level of compensation, or where the average cost is equal to the average revenue. Again, where the AR, average revenue curve, is also referred to as a demand curve, more commonly referred to as a demand curve, rather. So all costs, including reasonable profit, are under the cost curves and are considered opportunity cost. This condition is arrived at through competition and is only fully realized in perfect competition and long-term equilibrium. So now we've come full circle in this presentation on an area of microeconomics referred to as market structures, ranging from perfect competition all the way to monopoly. While there are always market imperfections resulting in less than perfectly competitive markets, the closer we get to perfectly competitive markets, the better it is for the consumer. So let's recap on what we've achieved by moving closer to the perfect competition. When efficiency is achieved, the per capita standard of living is at its maximum, again, for the given stock of productive resource, given state of technology. Consumers are paying a price equal to the marginal opportunity cost of producing the last unit. Average opportunity costs cannot be lower. They are at a minimum. Again, equity is also achieved. Households are receiving the greatest possible consumer surplus. It is maximized, subject to the constraint that all productive resources are receiving income equal to their opportunity cost, no more, no less. From the macroeconomic perspective, as an aside, heavy competition keeps prices down. Those would be in the form of substitutes, and tend to help markets to clear where there would be less sticky prices. Prices are able to rise and fall according to competitive pressures, resulting in fewer and less severe downturns. So now again, let's move on to some last words on competition and monopoly. And now let's review some differences between perfect competition and that monopoly. For the perfectly competitive firm, P equals MR, P being price, MR being marginal revenue. For the monopolist, P is greater than MR, or the price is greater than the marginal revenue. The perfectly competitive firm's demand curve is its marginal revenue curve. The monopolist's demand curve lies above its marginal revenue curve. The perfectly competitive firm charges a price equal to its marginal cost. The monopolist charges a price greater than marginal cost. A monopoly firm differs from a perfectly competitive firm in terms of how much consumer surplus the buyers receive. The consumer surplus is greater, of course, in the perfectly competitive case than in the monopoly case. So in closing, let's review the case against monopoly. Consider the deadweight loss of monopoly. The greater the output is produced, greater output is produced under perfect competition than under monopoly. It's pretty straightforward. The net value of the difference in these two output levels is said to be the deadweight loss of monopoly. This is the amount buyers value the additional output over and above the opportunity cost of producing the additional output. Lastly, let's talk about rent seeking. If firm A, for example, tries to get the government to transfer income or consumer surplus from buyers to itself, it is undertaking a transfer-seeking activity. In economics, these activities, again, are usually called rent-seeking.